War. You know, we've a test this week on it. This is the mind map. Should recognize a lot of this stuff. I've added some to it. So you can have a study of it on your teams, and I'll give you a copy of it in class tomorrow. I'm going to do the test on Thursday. Okay? Okay. 1954, 75. 54 is kind of an arbitrary year to start it. That's the conflict with the French, but obviously there was fighting in Vietnam during the Second World War against the Japanese and struggled with the French when they came back after the war. Anyway, ended in 75. We know that the Vietnam War was part of the wider Cold War, and this Cold War was that period of tension between 1945 and 1990, between the two contrasting systems of government, capitalism and democracy as represented by the United States, and communism and one-party government as represented by the Soviet Union. That struggle was defined by the Truman Doctrine. President Truman, post-World War II, Nazis are defeated, Japanese Empire is defeated, looks around the world and he sees, okay, what's the threats now? And he saw the threat in Soviet Russia and the spread of communism. And the Truman Doctrine led to two core beliefs in American Cold War policy: the domino theory and containment. The domino theory, as you know, means that if one country is allowed to go communist, then it will spread like a virus. So the example that I gave you was in regions. So if you have Southeast Asia, Vietnam goes communist, then Laos, then Cambodia, then Thailand, then Malaysia, then Indonesia. Where does it stop? Okay? So the American policy was containment, where you find communism, try and support local anti-communist forces to keep the communism under control so that it doesn't spread. That is at the core of what happened in Vietnam. Just a bit of background: Vietnam is a country in Southeast Asia. It was towards the end of the 19th century and for the first half of the 20th century a French colony until the Japanese invaded in the Second World War. The French came back after the end of the Second World War, but by 1954 they had been defeated by the Viet Minh, which was the local, by combination of forces, the Viet Minh was one of the local communist army. Communists took over North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam, a government which was anti-communist and led by a man called Diem. And he was a dictator who did not believe in democracy or civil rights or all the things that we take for granted today. But for America, he was anti-communist, so they backed him with money, particularly with money, but also with political and military support. We know that in the 1950s, the US president was Eisenhower. He was the first president to, post-1954, start to get America involved in Vietnam. And by 1960, this is during the Eisenhower era. Don't forget, the Eisenhower era ends in January 1961 when Kennedy becomes president. By 1960, the US have 1,500 military advisors already in Vietnam, and they're working with the South Vietnamese, trying to train them on how to combat the communists, particularly the Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong were, as I said, think about Ireland in the 1920, 1921. The IRA were the rebels, the guerrilla army. Well, Viet Cong were that equivalent. And we know, as I said, that the British response was bringing the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries to try and support the local RIC forces. And in the same way, the Americans sent in kind of unofficial. They weren't meant to be fighting, they were meant to be advisors, but they were involved in the fighting and training the South Vietnamese. As I said, Kennedy won the 60 election. So by 1961, he's the president. He said he didn't want to, get bogged down in Vietnam, but he increased tenfold the number of American military advisors. So that by the time he died in 1963, there were 16,000 American military personnel on the ground in Vietnam, training Vietnamese forces in counterinsurgency. Remember what counterinsurgency means? It means, how to fight rebels, how to fight guerrilla forces, not conventional warfare. Diem, following that famous moment when the Buddhist monk set himself on fire in the middle of a street in Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. He was assassinated in 1963, but nothing really changed in terms of South Vietnam. You still had a totalitarian government committed to fighting the communists and more reliant on American support. Kennedy was shot dead, as we know, in Dallas in the autumn of 1963. Lyndon Baines Johnson. The moment Kennedy died as vice president, that's the law in America. The moment an American president dies in office, the vice president becomes the president in law. Even before he takes the oath, he's the president. So Johnson takes over, and he I'll do a key personality map on him alone. He's a fascinating character, but he initially said, I want to support continue Kennedy's policies. I want to improve the living conditions of the poor, and that was called the Great Society program. And he wanted to continue Kennedy's civil rights, and this is for a different day, another mind map. And he was successful in pursuing more than Kennedy could possibly have been. And I won't go into why, but there's no doubt whatsoever that if Kennedy's still president, the Civil Rights Act doesn't get passed. But Johnson is president, the Civil Rights Act gets passed in 1964, and the Voting Rights Bill gets passed in 1965. So Johnson's role was central to that. So he could have been a great president, but Vietnam destroyed his presidency. He was hugely popular in 1964, won the biggest ever landslide victory in American presidential history. But in that election, he never talked about escalating American involvement in Vietnam. He didn't discuss it because he knew it would be unpopular with the voters. Despite that, we know that NSAM 273 and 288, those policy documents created by the American government, signalled that as soon as the election was over, the US would increase its involvement, particularly boots on the ground in terms of troop numbers and airstrikes into North Vietnam. We know what the Gulf of Tonkin incident was, this incident where the USS Maddox and another ship were attacked, it's probably that's an exaggeration, by North Vietnamese kind of small light craft, small boats. This was blown up as a much more serious incident than it actually was, and it was used by Johnson's administration as its excuse to ramp up or escalate US involvement. And the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which essentially was the American Congress giving Johnson the power to go to war in Vietnam, said that the United States government would take all necessary measures to defend itself against communist aggression, which essentially meant the gloves were off now. America was going full tilt into Vietnam. And you can see the escalation in these stats. In 1964, there were 23,000 US troops in Vietnam before the election. Year after the election, 184,000. That was the year that Operation Rolling Thunder began. We'll look at that in a second. By 66, 385,000. By 67, 486. By 68, over 500,000 troops. You can see how they got more and more involved. And the more troops they sent in, the more intense the fighting became, the more troops that were needed. Operation Rolling Thunder. There's a quote here from the United States Air Force website. I think it's worth reading. Operation Rolling Thunder was a frequently interrupted bombing campaign that began on the 24th of February 1965 and lasted until the end of October 68. During the period, US Air Force and Navy aircraft engaged in a bombing campaign designed to force Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader, to abandon his ambition to take over South Vietnam. The operation began primarily as a diplomatic signal to impress Hanoi, that's the North Vietnamese, with America's determination, essentially a warning that the violence would escalate until Ho Chi Minh blinked. And secondly, it was intended to bolster the sagging morale of the South Vietnamese. Those were its two aims. Neither of them worked. What we have to know is that by 1965, America is spending $1 billion a year in aid on South Vietnam per annum. And by 1968, the cost of the US involvement in Vietnam was $30 billion per annum. And we saw today in class, didn't we, that the overall estimated cost of American involvement in Vietnam is in modern money, $1 trillion. So the fruits of that economic boom that we studied earlier on in the year, they were wasted. And of course, this had a huge impact on Johnson's government. We need to be able to write a paragraph on US military tactics. We already talked about airstrikes on North Vietnam and the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was that supply route from North Vietnam down through Laos into South Vietnam. These search and destroy missions, we've seen the video footage, we've seen, film footage of, the helicopters going in, the US troops coming out, attacking what were perceived to be Viet Cong positions, and then evacuating out, attacking villages, causing huge resentment amongst the civilian population because of the casualties that were inflicted. We know they used napalm, this incendiary weapon where it dropped it and then ignited it and it burnt kind of whole areas of forest. And they used Agent Orange, this chemical designed to defoliate or destroy the tree cover that the Viet Cong were regarded as relying on. But of course, these tactics were fruitless and failed. We saw the tunnel system that the Viet Cong used. We know the Viet Cong had supports coming in the whole time from North Vietnam and from China, and Russian money coming in to support them. And we also know that the will of the people of Vietnam, South Vietnam, the majority of the people was with the communists. The more the war went on, the more unpopular it became at home. We did remember Muhammad Ali, when he was conscripted, saying that no Viet Cong ever called me the N-word, and refusing to be drafted and losing his titles, being sentenced to jail. He never went to jail, we know that, but you can see that in that one example, I might put that in here actually, in that one example, how it was so unpopular. We talked about music and how people like Country Joe and the Fish with their 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for song, and John Lennon with Give Peace a Chance from the Beatles, were giving voice to young people's frustrations with this war that they thought was pointless and cruel and a waste of lives. We know that there were mass anti-war rallies outside the White House in Washington, all over America, particularly outside of the Democratic Conference in Chicago in 1968. There was a lot of violence there. I told you the police battered a lot of the anti-war protesters. So it became more and more and more divisive. Americans, a huge significant population or proportion of the American population, continued to support the war because they saw it as their duty, their patriotic duty to support the war. But there was a very, very, very large kind of proportion of the population that was completely opposed to the war, particularly amongst young people. LBJ, as I said, like one of the most fascinating figures in all of history. I've got a whole load of books about his life behind me here. What was the effect on him? Well, his ambition, the Great Society program, to use this wealth that America had to improve the standard of living of ordinary Americans, to bring, people out of poverty, to bring education, to eradicate crime, all gone. That money was wasted in Vietnam. He became the figure of hate for the anti-war movement, and that chant, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" haunted him everywhere he went. And by 1968, this incredibly popular figure, this less than 4 years before, this guy who wins a massive landslide, by 1968, he's decided, I'm not running for president. I can't win. The Tet Offensive in 1968, as we know, this coordinated attack of the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, and the South Vietnamese Viet Cong on American positions in Hanoi and all over the country, was an utter failure for the communists. The numbers speak for themselves. 60,000 communist troops were killed. Only 6,000 combined US and South Vietnamese personnel were killed. 2,000 South Vietnamese, 4,000 Americans. 15,000 civilians were killed, caught up in the fighting. But 60,000 against 6,000, that's 10 to 1. That's a massive defeat for the communists. But the impact of the Tet Offensive, the shock it had, the media depiction of what was going on in, did I mention Walter Cronkite over here? Like Walter Cronkite, I'm going to show you the quote in a minute, very famous, broadcast to the nation that we can't win here. This was absolutely vital, the Tet Offensive, not in a military sense, but in terms of the support, the American public support for the war. They just didn't believe what their government were telling them anymore. They didn't believe that this was a winnable conflict, and that's where the credibility gap, that famous credibility gap, grew between what the government was saying and what people believed. By the end of '68, Johnson, he's no skin in the game anymore in terms of looking for an election. There's nothing to lose, so he goes to try to send his people to Paris to sit down with the North Vietnamese and the Ho Chi Minh's, by that stage Ho Chi Minh is dead, but the communist representatives to try and work out a solution to find a way to get America the hell out of there. But the two sides were miles apart, and by the time the election happens, Nixon, the next president, so we had Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, LBJ, Nixon, all of them were involved in this in one way or another. Nixon is elected, and he's the Republican hard man, and he says we will win, and he redoubled American efforts, kept on spending money, supported a secret bombing campaign in Laos and Cambodia, which had a hugely damaging impact in those countries, but none of it worked. America was on the back foot. South Vietnam was utterly corrupt, and they couldn't fight. It was the 70s, the early 70s were just a string of misery for Americans in Vietnam. By 1975, the country's lost, and we saw the footage of the evacuation from the American embassy. And it's the first war America ever lost. Utter humiliation, hugely damaging for the country and for those troops who came home. You know, we've seen some of the films. Hamburger Hill, Born the 4th of July, Full Metal Jacket, Platoon. If you want to just watch some of those movies, and you'll see the impact that this whole thing had on that generation. And at the end of it, after all that money and all that pain, Vietnam becomes communist. And after all that money and all that pain, Cambodia next door becomes communist. And after all that money and all that pain, Laos has a communist insurgency. So yeah, the domino theory. So there you go. You'll see when I post this up on your teams. I just found out that I can't claim any work here, but I went and found a website that had some really, really good quotes from around Vietnam, and we'll read those in class. But I just want to finish by reading that Walter Cronkite broadcast in 1968. For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is the end in a stalemate. To say we are closer to victory today is to believe in the face of the evidence the optimists who have been wrong in the past. So that was Walter Cronkite, one of the most trusted voices in America, talking to the American people on television on February 27, 1968, following the Tet Offensive. And he's saying we can't win. Anti-war movement. So I'll post that onto Teams now. We won't do the test tomorrow. We'll do the test on Thursday.